You just watched Stephanie White, the current head coach of the Indiana Fever, stand at a podium in Connecticut and tell the entire sports world that the media needs to stop letting social media trolls frame the narrative. She said it was unacceptable. She said everyone needed to do better. She said the story should be about basketball, not about who was being attacked and how. And then, 2 months after saying all of that, she accepted the Indiana Fever head coaching job, the most scrutinized, most watched, and most dissected coaching position in the entire history of women's professional basketball. This is the job where scrutiny doesn't just follow you around. It moves into your house, puts its feet on your furniture, and leaves the refrigerator door open. I'm Dre on Fiverr. This is Street Hoops, and today we're pulling on every single thread of what's happening inside the Indiana Fever organization. Why Sophie Cunningham's elbow has half the basketball internet losing its mind, and why the trust between this franchise and its fan base is sitting somewhere between critical condition and life support. Let me set the table for you, because the story of Sophie Cunningham being ruled out for Thursday night's game against the Chicago Sky is about much more than one player missing one game with a sore elbow. It's about optics. It's about a trust deficit that has been growing and growing between the Indiana Fever organization and the millions of fans who turn this franchise into the most culturally significant team in women's professional sports. It's about a coaching staff that, on multiple occasions now, has created situations where even the most reasonable, level-headed people in the room are left with no choice but to raise their hands and ask uncomfortable questions out loud. And if you came here today looking for someone to tell you to calm down, trust the process, and give the front office the benefit of the doubt, I want you to know from the very first minute that you came to the wrong channel. So here's what happened. Sophie Cunningham, the Indiana Fever's starting caliber wing, and the player the entire fan base has embraced as the team's hard-nosed enforcer, was officially ruled out for Indiana's Commissioner's Cup matchup against the Chicago Sky due to a right elbow injury. It was her first missed game of the entire 2026 season. She had played in all 11 games up to that point, averaging nearly 9 points per game in just under 23 minutes of action. Her best performance of the young season came against the Seattle Storm, when she exploded for a season-high 17 points. By all accounts, she had been one of the most reliable and consistent pieces in a Fever rotation that has otherwise been marked by chaos and inconsistency. And then, less than 24 hours before tip-off against a Chicago Sky team that had been struggling badly, she was gone. Here's where the alarm bells start ringing. And I want you to understand exactly why nobody saw this coming. There was no build-up. There was no moment in a previous game where Sophie grabbed her elbow and grimaced. There was no mention of soreness during any post-game media availability. There was no subtle indication on the injury report in the days leading up to it. She was healthy 1 minute. And then the next morning she appeared on the injury report as questionable with a right elbow issue that apparently nobody outside the Fever training room knew anything about. And it wasn't until Stephanie White sat down for her pre-game press conference on Thursday that the public got any explanation at all. White mentioned, almost in passing, that the elbow had actually been sore for a while, and that the training staff had been treating it and trying to get Cunningham ready to play. Stop right there. The elbow had been sore for a while. Treatment had already been underway. This was not a new, acute injury that happened during practice on Tuesday morning. This was an ongoing issue that the organization had been managing internally for some period of time without telling anyone. And the first time the public heard about any of it was when Sophie appeared on the injury report less than 24 hours before a nationally relevant game. Now I want to be careful here, because I'm about to say something that I need you to really hear. I am not accusing the Indiana Fever of manufacturing a fake injury. I am not saying Sophie Cunningham is perfectly healthy and sitting out for reasons that have nothing to do with her elbow. What I am saying, and what I think any honest observer of this franchise over the past 2 seasons would agree with, is that the Indiana Fever have created this reality entirely on their own. Every bit of the suspicion and skepticism that flooded social media the moment that injury report dropped was built brick by brick, decision by decision, by this organization. You know why people assume the worst whenever this organization releases information? Because this organization has repeatedly given them reasons to. When Caitlin Clark sat out a game earlier this season with what later turned out to be a back issue, the way that situation was handled left fans confused, frustrated, and speculating for days. The communication was late, incomplete, and in some ways contradictory to SO when the next unexplained injury surfaces. When another player suddenly disappears from the lineup with minimal context and no warning, the trust account is already overdrawn. You cannot keep making withdrawals without making deposits, and this front office has been spending trust like it grows on trees. Let me tell you something about Sophie Cunningham specifically, because her role on this team makes the timing of this injury hit differently than it would for almost any other player on the roster. Sophie Cunningham is not just a rotation player. She is part of this team's identity in ways that the stat sheet barely captures. She is the enforcer. She is the player who sets the physical and emotional tone. She is the woman who, when things get rough, ugly, and physical on the floor, steps into that space without hesitation and makes it clear that the Indiana Fever are not going to be bullied. The fan base, particularly the passionate, vocal, deeply invested core of Caitlin Clark supporters, absolutely adores her for it. The chants of "Free Sophie" after any flagrant foul call against her are not ironic. That is genuine affection. That is a player who has earned her place in the hearts of this fan base by showing up and competing with everything she is every single night. And here's another thing about Sophie Cunningham that makes this situation even more layered. She was the player who delivered the inbound pass that led to the most iconic moment of the 2026 WNBA season so far. With the Indiana Fever trailing the Washington Mystics by 1 point and just over 4 seconds remaining, Sophie Cunningham took the ball out of bounds, surveyed the floor, and launched a perfect cross-court pass to Caitlin Clark. Clark caught it, stepped back, and buried a deep three-pointer with 1.2 seconds left to win the game. The arena erupted. The internet followed immediately afterward. For about 12 hours, everything was perfect in Fever Nation. Sophie Cunningham was a hero. Caitlin Clark was Caitlin Clark. The world made sense. And then, the day after the game, the entire moment became a controversy. Cunningham posted a graphic on social media that many fans interpreted as suggesting the final play had not actually gone according to plan, that she had gone off script on the inbound pass and improvised the play to Clark rather than executing exactly what Stephanie White had drawn up. The internet exploded. Then Cunningham returned and commented on the post, saying that people were reading too much into it, and that the play was, in fact, exactly what the coach had designed and that they executed it perfectly. So she walked it back. She said it all happened according to plan. Except then Lexi Hull appeared on a radio show and told a different version of the story. Hull said, and I am paraphrasing here, that she could not say the game winner was exactly what they drew up, but it worked and they would happily take the result. Hull acknowledged that the play broke down. She said Clark made a great read, Cunningham delivered a perfect pass, and the result was a victory. That a broken play became a winning play. That is basketball. That it happens all the time. There is nothing wrong with that. Great players improvise. Clutch players deliver when the original play falls apart, but here is the problem. Now you have two Fever players appearing on two different platforms and telling two contradictory versions of the exact same play. Cunningham says it was exactly what Stephanie White drew up. Hull says it was not what they drew up, but it worked anyway. Both versions cannot be true at the same time. One of those accounts is spin. And when you are an organization already struggling with credibility, when your coaching staff has already faced public questions about decision-making, and when the entire basketball world is analyzing your every move under 100 times magnifying glass, contradictory public statements about a game-winning play are not a small issue. It adds fuel to a fire that was already burning. And my personal view is that what happened is probably exactly what it looked like. The play broke down. Sophie Cunningham, being the instinctive and competitive player she is, saw Caitlin Clark getting open on the weak side and made the pass based on pure basketball instinct. Clark, being Caitlin Clark, knocked down the shot, and then someone inside the organization decided the narrative needed to be managed. Suddenly, what had been a spontaneous moment of brilliance from an improvising inbounder became exactly the play our coach drew up. Why? Why does a winning play need to be retroactively credited to the coaching staff's design, when the player involved initially appeared to suggest something different on social media before later clarifying her comments? What exactly is being protected? And does anyone inside that building understand that every time they try to manage a narrative that did not need managing, they end up creating a story that never existed in the first place? Now let's get back to Stephanie White, because she sits at the center of every one of these storylines, and she cannot escape the weight of her own history. Let's go back to September 2024 one more time. The context of that press conference was genuine and serious. Alyssa Thomas and other Connecticut Sun players had been subjected to vile, racist, and deeply personal attacks on social media from a segment of the Fever fan base during that playoff series. That part is real, that is documented. That is unambiguously wrong and completely indefensible, and Stephanie White's condemnation of that behavior at the time was entirely appropriate and justified. But when White made those remarks, she did not draw a clear distinction between racist harassment and legitimate sports criticism. She framed the entire conversation as a media problem, a systemic failure of journalists and platforms to prevent bad actors from shaping the narrative, and whether she intended to or not. That framing created a rhetorical catch-all that could later be used to dismiss criticism of the Indiana Fever franchise, the very franchise she would eventually go on to coach, under the umbrella of trolls controlling the narrative. Any independent sports creator, any non-credentialed journalist, or any passionate fan with a YouTube channel or an X account who asks tough questions about this organization risks being grouped into the same category of troll White was describing. Not because their questions are baseless, but because the framing makes it convenient to dismiss them. I want to be direct about this because it matters. I have been covering sports for 6 years. Not for ESPN, not for CBS, not for any of the legacy media outlets that receive credentialed seats at Fever press conferences. My platform exists on YouTube and across social media. The same platforms White described as sources of toxicity and noise. And based on everything I have watched unfold between this organization and independent media, the Indiana Fever appear to operate with a communications philosophy that treats questions from outside the traditional press establishment as inherently suspicious. If you do not have a media badge, if you do not have institutional backing, if your audience found you rather than discovering you through a decades-old media brand, then your scrutiny is considered noise. Your questions are trolling. Your coverage is part of the problem. That is wrong. And the fact that Stephanie White accepted the most heavily scrutinized coaching job in women's basketball history, fully aware of the attention it would bring, because everyone told her and the history was already documented, yet still appears to operate as though that scrutiny can be managed through press conference messaging, rather than transparent communication and organizational consistency, is the fundamental disconnect at the heart of everything happening in Indianapolis right now. Here is something that should not be controversial to say. Caitlin Clark brought millions of new eyes to this sport, not just casual viewers, but deeply invested fans who watch every game, follow every practice report, track every injury update, and consume every piece of content connected to this team. Those fans came because of Clark, but they stayed because of the entire Fever roster, because of Aaliyah Boston's quiet excellence, because of Kelsey Mitchell's toughness, because of Sophie Cunningham's fire. They are not trolls. They are the new mainstream audience that the WNBA negotiated a massive media rights deal to attract. And when that audience asks questions that make the organization uncomfortable, the response cannot be to dismiss them as a fringe problem that the media should stop amplifying. You wanted the new deal, you wanted the new money, you wanted the 2.5 million viewers, the sold-out arenas, the merchandise sales, and the cultural relevance. Congratulations. You got all of it, and what comes with all of that is exactly what comes with it in the NFL, NBA, MLB, and every major professional sports league. Scrutiny. Real scrutiny. The kind where people notice when communication does not add up. The kind where an unexplained injury at an inconvenient moment creates more questions than a transparent announcement would have. The Fever and their coaching staff did not sign up for a protected garden. They signed up for the big stage, and the big stage has rules. Now here is the kicker. The thing that ties this entire day together in a way that would almost feel poetic if it were not so frustrating. The game happened. Sophie Cunningham sat in street clothes at Gainbridge Fieldhouse with a sore right elbow, and Caitlin Clark went out and recorded 32 points and 10 assists. Aaliyah Boston was historic, posting 34 points and 12 rebounds, making Clark and Boston the first pair of teammates in WNBA history to record 30-point double-doubles in the same game. Indiana defeated Chicago 114-106 in overtime after nearly giving the game away in the closing seconds of regulation when a turnover on an inbound play, note the irony, allowed Chicago to tie the game with a deep three-pointer, but they survived. They won. The Fever improved to 7-5 on the season. So in the narrowest sense, everything worked out. The enforcer Saturday the Stars delivered. And the win went into the standings. And you can already hear the organizational response forming. See? We managed it fine. The team won. Everyone is overreacting. That is going to be the message. That IT is always the message when a controversial decision does not ultimately cost them on the scoreboard. But the scoreboard is not the only thing being measured. Trust is being measured. Credibility is being measured. The relationship between this organization and the fan base that supports it is being measured every single day, not just when the final buzzer sounds. Because here is the reality of the Indiana Fever today. They entered the 2026 season with championship expectations after reaching the WNBA semifinals the year before. They have Caitlin Clark in her prime. They have Aaliyah Boston playing some of the best basketball of her career. They have Kelsey Mitchell, one of the league's proven scorers. On paper, this roster should be competing for a championship. Yet they sit at 7-5 with a coaching controversy that refuses to disappear. An injury communication issue that repeatedly creates unnecessary drama. And a head coach who publicly promised to help clean up the toxicity surrounding this franchise while simultaneously becoming one of the central figures in the controversies she hoped to avoid. Stephanie White is not a bad basketball coach, let me be clear. She won WNBA Coach of the Year with the Connecticut Sun in 2023. She led that team to 3 consecutive semifinal appearances. She has spent decades in this league as a player, assistant coach, and head coach. She knows basketball. But coaching Caitlin Clark is different from coaching any roster she has managed before. Clark is not simply a player, she is a phenomenon. She is the reason hundreds of new media outlets, millions of new fans, and an entire generation of independent content creators arrived in women's basketball and never left. And the pressure that comes with coaching a phenomenon of that scale requires a level of transparency and media relations sophistication that goes beyond traditional coaching abilities. Right now that transparency is not there. And until it is, every sore elbow, every late scratch, every contradictory press conference statement, every improvised inbound pass that later gets reframed as a design play, all of it will continue generating exactly this kind of reaction. Not because the fans are trolls, not because independent media are acting in bad faith, but because trust, once damaged repeatedly in small ways, must be actively rebuilt. It does not magically repair itself because the team wins a game. As for Sophie Cunningham, she is likely going to be fine. Reports indicate the elbow has been sore for some time, which suggests a manageable issue rather than a significant structural injury. She is tough. She battled back from a torn MCL that ended her previous season early. She returned this year and played every game until now. She is not going anywhere, and whenever she returns, whether it's the next game or the game after, the crowd at Gainbridge Fieldhouse will welcome her back like a returning hero, because she has earned that level of support. But until this organization fundamentally changes how it communicates with the outside world, until the Fever front office, Stephanie White, Amber Cox, Kelly Krauskopf, and everyone involved understand that the new audience they invited into the sport expects to be treated as informed participants, rather than people who simply need to be managed, this cycle will continue. Injury confusion, communication gaps, fan reaction, organizational frustration, media criticism, accusations of toxicity, rinse and repeat. The Fever is too talented to remain trapped in this cycle forever, but right now they are choosing to stay in it, and that responsibility belongs to them. Alright, Street Hoops family, that is where things stand today. Sophie Cunningham and the right elbow that broke the internet. Stephanie White and the 2024 press conference that continues to follow her. Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston, making WNBA history, on a night when the story should have been simple and straightforward. Instead we got drama, contradictions, skepticism, and a storyline that somehow still does not feel fully resolved. That if you made it this far, I already know you are built differently. This is the Street Hoops community. No fluff, no spin, no corporate protection. Just the story all the way down. So hit that like button, because the algorithm needs to know that real basketball content still matters. Drop your hottest take in the comments. Do you think the Fever's injury communication problems are simply an organizational failure? Or do you think something more calculated is happening behind the scenes? I want to read every comment, and if you are not subscribed to Street Hoops yet, I honestly do not know what you are doing. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the Indiana Fever are going to keep generating headlines whether they want to or not, and when they do, Dre Fiver will be right here. This is Street Hoops, peace.